This house is mine. I want you gone.
Are you certain about the paperwork?
My attorneys reviewed everything. There is nothing.
Nada said those words in the middle of her own launch party. 50 guests around her. A string quartet paused between sets. She had rehearsed that line for weeks. She believed every syllable of it. The man she was dismissing did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his phone. He looked at her the way a person looks at a house they already know is about to come down. What had he already prepared? And how long before that night had it been sitting there, waiting? If you're the kind of person who notices the quiet ones, the ones who never raise their voice, because they don't need to, subscribe now so you're here for the next one. This channel is where those stories live. There's a kind of silence that moves into a room after someone says something they can never take back. Not an empty silence, a silence where everyone understands all at once that the conversation they thought they were having was never the real one. My name is Marcus Webb. I restore furniture for a living. 19 years now. Chairs, tables, cabinets built before anyone alive today was born. People bring me pieces that are falling apart, and I find what's still good underneath the damage, and I build from there. It is not a glamorous trade. It teaches you to look closely. It teaches you that the thing holding a structure together is rarely the thing you can see. When Renata told me to pack my things, the first detail I noticed had nothing to do with her. Words. It was the reading lamp. Someone had moved it 3 inches to the left, angled differently. A small thing, but I spend my days noticing what has shifted in a room and why. That lamp told me more than her speech did. I had restored half the furniture in that house myself. The oak sideboard in the dining room. The desk in my workshop off the east wing. I knew every joint and every seam because I had put most of them there. The house belonged to the Whitfield Trust. My grandmother's trust, established for decades before I was born, built to hold family property across generations so no single marriage or lawsuit or bad decade could ever put it at risk. The trust owned the house. It paid the taxes. It paid the insurance. It paid for every repair on the roof and the foundation. My name did not sit on the deed as an individual. Neither did Renata's. That had been true from the day we moved in. It was still true on the night she told me to leave. She did not know what she was standing on. I want to explain how that happens. How a person can live inside a thing for 14 years and never once understand what it actually is. It doesn't take deception. It takes a kind of confidence, so complete it stops looking like anything worth questioning. Renata had that. Confidence in abundance. It made her extraordinary at her job. And in the end, it was the exact thing that undid her. We met at a fundraising gala when she was 2 years into her role at Ashford Memorial, the hospital system where she now ran development and donor relations. I had a small stall, showing restored pieces for a charity auction. She walked past every table in that room like she already knew what was on it. She asked no question she didn't already know the answer to. I admired that. I also noticed quietly that the same quality taken far enough stops being preparation. It starts being a refusal to ask. The prenuptial agreement was signed 14 years ago. I did not ask for it out of suspicion. It was a structural requirement of the trust. Diane Marsh, the family attorney, had explained it to both of us plainly. Diane had represented my grandmother before I was born. She drew up the agreement herself and offered, in writing, to refer Renata to independent counsel so someone would review it purely on her behalf. Renata declined. She signed every page, 9 pages, at a table in Diane's office on a Wednesday morning. The way people sign things they don't believe will ever come up again. The language was direct. The trust on the house. Renata's right to live there was tied to the marriage, remaining intact. She had no right to sell it, borrow against it, or use it as collateral for anything. I hadn't hidden any of it. I simply hadn't dwelled on it because we were 27 and getting married in a month, and the conversation that felt urgent that week was never about asset structure. That is the first thing I thought about 5 months before the night Renata told me to leave. sitting across from Diane at a routine trust review. Diane reviewed the trust every 2 years. Standard procedure. We were going through updated appraisals when she set her pen down and asked me something I had not been expecting. Does Renata understand her actual position with this property? Not the general shape of it, the specifics. I thought it through honestly before I answered. She knows it connects to the family trust. She doesn't know exactly what that means day to day. We've never had a reason to walk through it. Diane wrote something in the margin. If the marriage were ever contested, that distinction would matter a great deal. What she signed is clear, but clarity on a page and clarity in someone's head aren't always the same thing. I left with a summary Diane had printed for me, and I sat with it the whole drive home. Not suspicion exactly, just the kind of attention you finally give something you've been taking for granted. By the time I reached my workshop, I understood there were conversations I couldn't keep postponing forever. What I didn't know yet was how little time I actually had left. The signs had been building for months before I could name them. Renata's phone face down on every surface. That habit hadn't existed a year earlier. Late nights with reasons that were technically believable but thin if you pressed on them. Conferences I couldn't match against the shared calendar she'd given me access to years before and never revoked. Later, when the investigator's report confirmed the relationship had started 10 months before Renata ended the marriage, I understood I had been reading every one of those signals correctly. I just hadn't let myself name them yet. About 3 months in, I started keeping notes. Not to build a case, just because I restore things for a living, and when the pieces of something stop fitting the way they used to, you write it down before you decide what it means. The afternoon, I came home early and found Renata and Elliot Voss together in the living room. I had a repair estimate in my hand for a client with an urgent deadline. I set the folder down on the entry table the moment I understood what I was looking at. I didn't shout. I didn't ask for an explanation. I stood in the doorway and looked at both of them. Renata didn't reach for an apology. She lifted her chin, the exact gesture she used walking into a boardroom. She spoke first. She said the marriage was over. She said Elliot understood where she was headed better than I ever had. She said the house would stay with her, since her income had carried more of the household for years. Elliot said something about turning my workshop into a home gym. I looked at the reading chair I had restored with my own hands. I looked at the built-in shelving I had designed and installed myself, every measurement calibrated to make the room feel larger than it was. I looked at Renata's face. There was no uncertainty in it anywhere. Then I asked her, as calm as I could manage, if she was sure about the paperwork on the property. She told me her attorneys had already reviewed everything. Nothing my name. She said it with the confidence of someone who had gotten the answer she wanted and stopped asking questions right there. What her attorneys had actually reviewed was the deed itself. It listed no individual owner. They took the absence of my name as proof the house was marital property. They never traced it further. They never looked for a trust behind that absence, because Renata never told them to look, because she didn't know it was there to find. I didn't correct her. I told her I'd come back for my things. I shook Elliot's hand once, a small gesture that clearly confused him, which was the point. And I left. I called Diane from the car. She picked up before the second ring. I told her what happened. In 3 sentences. There was a pause on her end. Not shock. The kind of pause that comes right before someone starts organizing. I had a feeling we were getting close to this, she said. How do you want to handle it? Carefully, I said, and completely. Come in tomorrow morning. I pulled something last week you need to see. What did you pull? Loan applications. 2 different lenders. The house is listed as collateral on both. I sat with that for the rest of the drive. Elliot Voss was the chief operating officer at Ashford Memorial, a man whose entire job was evaluating risk and financial structure for a living. And he was also a man who had looked at a deed with a name he didn't recognize on it, and simply accepted Renata's word that the house was hers to use. He never pulled the full title history. He never found the trust. From what I later learned through Diane, when the unfamiliar name came back on the search, went straight to Renata, and she told him it was leftover paperwork from an old family arrangement that no longer applied. He took the word of a hospital executive as sufficient. Verification, a shortcut his own job should have warned him against. But her confidence made it feel safe. I thought about Priya on that same drive. Priya had been apprenticing with me for 7 months, 24 years old, with an eye for proportion that was already sharper than mine had been at that age, doing the slow, invisible work of building a reputation from nothing. 6 months earlier, I had recommended Priya for a restoration contract at Ashford Memorials. New donor wing, a project big enough to let her lease her own studio space for the first time. Priya had prepared for that pitch for 3 weeks. The work was genuinely excellent. I had seen every drawing. What happened at that pitch, Priya told me afterward, sitting in my workshop with coffee, going cold on the bench. The contract got quietly redirected to a firm Elliot had a prior relationship with. Renata sat in the room the entire time. She said nothing in Priya's defense. Priya lost the contract, and with it, the momentum she needed for the next stage of her career. Now I understood exactly why that decision had gone the way it did. The next morning, I met Diane at 8. She laid 3 documents across her desk. The first was the trust certification, formal proof of the house's ownership structure, the date it was acquired, the full history of every tax payment, every insurance premium, every repair, all drawn from trust accounts, none from any joint marital fund. The second was the prenuptial agreement, flagged at the residence clause. The third was a summary of the loan applications, pulled through a title monitoring service. Diane kept running on every trust property as standard precaution, a precaution that had just turned a routine divorce into something considerably heavier. She certified the property as a marital asset, Diane said, on 2 separate applications, both filed inside the last month. What do you need from me? Time, she said, and for Renata to keep doing exactly what she's already doing. The more publicly she claims this house, the stronger our record becomes. I understood the shape of what she meant. The strongest structures are the ones where every piece does double work, where the thing that looks decorative is actually load bearing. Every move Renata made in the coming weeks would become part of a record the trust could stand on. I asked Diane to bring in an investigator she trusted and to organize everything she already had. I asked her to move slowly, not fast, and to be ready on short notice the moment I told her was time. I've been ready for months, she said. Otis Graham called that afternoon to confirm our next meeting. Otis had backed 3 of my largest restoration commissions over the years, a careful man whose continued confidence mattered enormously for what came next. I confirmed the meeting and said nothing more. The days that followed had a rhythm to them, quiet on the surface, entirely deliberate. Underneath, Renata moved fast after I left. By the end of the first week, she'd changed the bedroom locks and started boxing my things in the garage. She told mutual friends I had accepted the split and would be fully out within a month. There was no performance in the way she told it. That was what made it dangerous. She wasn't lying. She had told herself a story about our marriage for so long she could no longer separate it from fact. I said nothing publicly. I let her talk. By the second week, Elliot had moved several things into the house. A neighbor mentioned an unfamiliar car in the driveway most mornings. Priya, working with me on a new commission, mentioned seeing Renata and a man she didn't recognize at a restaurant near the hospital district. Papers spread across the table between them. Columns of numbers. Multiple pages. The kind of spread that looks like someone building a case. That night, I called Diane. She told me she'd already been tracking 2 separate lender inquiries in the past week. The applications were moving forward. They weren't waiting. The settlement offer arrived on a Thursday by email from a firm I had never heard of. 4 pages written in the flat, clean language of a document built to close something rather than negotiated. I would give up every claim to the house in exchange for a payment Renata described in a note she wrote herself rather than letting her lawyer write it as generous. considering what I had actually put into the marriage. The number was not generous. It was the number you offer someone you believe has no other option, and you want it settled before they find one. I sent it to Diane without comment. She called within the hour. Don't respond yet. Let them sit with it. Every day they wait, they assume you're weighing it. And every day they assume that they keep moving forward with the financing. Is that what we want? We need them fully committed. We need those loan applications processed and the declarations locked in on record. Move too early and they'll retract everything, call it preliminary. Wait until the lenders have the whole picture and there's nothing left to retract. I understood the logic. You don't correct a structural flaw while someone is still drawing the plans. You correct it once they've committed it to materials. Once undoing it costs more than admitting it. I sent Diane one message. How long? 2 weeks, she wrote back. Maybe less if they move fast. The investigator, a woman named Carla Reyes who had worked with Diane's firm for years, delivered her first report at the end of the second week. It confirmed everything I already understood from the pattern I'd been living inside for months. But reading it laid out in dates and receipts carried a weight that quietly knowing never had. 10 months. Hotel charges. A weekend in Charleston, Renata had told me at the time was a conference. I read it once, set it face down on my workbench, and went back to the cabinet. I'd been restoring. What I let myself feel that evening, after the shop had emptied out, wasn't rage exactly, and it wasn't grief the way grief usually announces itself. It was quieter than both. The feeling of watching a support beam fail in slow motion and realizing the building had already been shifting for longer than you'd noticed, and what you were feeling now was simply the moment it became visible. I sat with it for one evening. Then I filed the report and went back to the cabinet. On a Saturday in the third week, Renata called. I answered because Diane had told me. Anything Renata said on record might matter, and ending calls only creates confrontations that are harder to manage later. Her voice was measured, the register she used for board meetings. She said she'd sent an offer and hadn't heard back. She said she was trying to be fair. Her attorneys were confident in their position. I asked what exactly they'd reviewed. They'd pulled the deed. No individual name on it. That was all. I told her I understood, and that I'd be in touch through counsel. After the call, I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about one phrase she'd used mid-conversation. Other things are moving. That was confirmation Diane had been waiting for. The financing was active. Renata needed the property claims settled before those applications closed. I texted Diane 3 words. She called ready. Diane wrote back in under a minute. Party invitation. I'd already heard 3 days earlier about the event Renata was planning. A colleague of mine had gotten an invitation, a gathering at the house to launch a new wellness foundation. Renata and a business partner were starting. I told Diane the day I heard. It's better than anything I could have designed, she said. Among the guest names my colleague mentioned was a member of Ashford Memorial's board, someone who'd been in the room when Priya's contract was redirected. I passed the name to Diane. She noted it without comment. Renata was about to publicly claim ownership of the house in front of a room of professional witnesses, including someone with direct authority over her conduct at work. 12 days. Out. I messaged Diane. She's hosting a launch event in 12 days. Perfect, she wrote back. That's our room. In the days between that call and the event, Renata staged the house. Contractors came through to prepare it for presentation, the kind of work you do when you want a space to read is settled and undeniably yours. Priya came in a workshop on a Wednesday to go over new drawings. Afterwards, she mentioned running into a contractor she knew at a supply house. He'd hit a permit snag at the house because the property system kept returning a trust name instead of an individual owner. He'd flagged it to the property manager before continuing, which delayed the work by 2 days. Priya passed it along because it seemed unusual. I asked her to write down exactly what he'd said, date it, and bring it in the next morning. She didn't ask why. She just wrote it down. The invitation listed 7 o'clock. I told Diane I'd arrive at 7:15. She said she'd arrive at 7:30 not a minute earlier, because the sequence required Renata to make her claims fully and publicly before any response showed up. The night before, Diane confirmed everything she'd bring. The prenuptial agreement, the trust certification, the full payment history, Carla's investigative report, the lender, notifications already drafted, the formal record of both loan applications, each carrying Renata's signed declaration that the house was marital property, each sent to lenders who had not yet been told that declaration was false. I asked if the lenders had been contacted yet. Not yet, she said. We contact them in the room. No question about the sequence. I set an empty case by my workshop door that night, ready for morning. I arrived at 7:15 with the case in my hand. The house looked exactly as it always had from the street. Same proportions I'd studied the day we moved in. Same light through the front windows I'd spent 3 weeks calibrating before we ever brought in a single piece of furniture. A catering van sat at the curb. Through the front window, I could see people moving in warm amber light, the result of fixture choices I'd made myself years earlier for entirely different reasons. I rang the bell instead of using my key. The gesture was deliberate. It told anyone watching that I was arriving as a man who'd accepted his position. Renata opened the door herself. She looked at the case, then at me, and her expression carried the calm satisfaction of someone watching a plan land exactly on schedule. She let me in without warmth and without hostility either, the way you let in something you were already expecting. The room held maybe 50 people, colleagues from the hospital, 2 faces I recognized as commercial lending contacts, one of them a woman my colleague had described to me by name. Otis Graham stood near the shelving I'd built, holding a glass of water, watching the room with the same careful attention he brought to every meeting. And near the far wall, in conversation with 2 hospital contacts, stood the board member whose name had been on the guest list, the same person who'd been in the room when Priya's contract was redirected. I'd pointed the name out to Diane. She noted it without comment. Elliot moved through the room near the center, his hand landing at the small of Renata's back whenever he stood close enough. The body language between them wasn't careful anymore. It was open, easy, the posture of people who decided the relevant parties had already been informed, and the matter was now simply settled fact. When I walked in, Elliot's eyes went to the case first, then to my face. Something in his shoulders eased, the small settling of a man watching something he'd been expecting finally arrive on schedule. I set the case down near the workshop door, the room off the east wing that used to be mine, now rearranged into something meant to read as a lounge. I stood near it, accepted a glass of water from the catering staff, and waited. Renata moved to the center of the room at 7:25. The gathering quieted the way. A room does when someone with social authority decides to address it. Nothing announced, just a shift in her bearing. She spoke for a few minutes about the new foundation, about the partnership she and Elliot were building, about everything that had led her to this point. She referenced the house with the easy familiarity of ownership. My home, this space I've built, using the word without a flicker of hesitation. The lending contact made a note on the small card in her hand. The board member listened without expression. Then Renata looked at me directly. She said she was glad I'd come to collect the rest of my things, and that she hoped the transition would be smooth for both of us. She said it in the register people use when they're being publicly generous to someone they don't believe has standing to argue back. A few guests glanced my way with the polite sympathy of people who'd already decided what kind of story this was. Elliot stepped forward and handed me a document, a legal notice barring me from the property without Renata's consent. He delivered it with the ease of a man who had long since stopped feeling any discomfort handing over bad news. He said something about my workshop being better suited to a different location. I took it. I read it without expression. Then I looked at Renata and asked her the same question I'd asked the afternoon I first walked out. Are you sure about the paperwork on this property? Her jaw tightened slightly. She said her attorneys had reviewed everything, that there was nothing in my name, and that if I had concerns, I was welcome to raise them through counsel. At the appropriate time. Good, I said, because mine just arrived. The front door opened at 7:30 exactly. Diane Marsh crossed the entry in the same measured stride she'd used walking into. Contested rooms for 30 years, the kind of pace that communicates authority more reliably than raised voices ever could. She carried her leather case in one hand. She set it on the dining table and opened it without asking anyone's permission. She placed the first document face up and looked at Renata. I'll need you to sign an acknowledgement that you've received these. Renata's attorney, standing near the kitchen, stepped forward and said his client hadn't consented to this taking place in this setting. Diane looked at him with the calm of someone who'd heard that particular objection more times than she could count. Your client publicly claimed ownership of this property about 3 minutes ago in front of 50 witnesses. This setting is the appropriate response to that. He said something else. Diane had already turned back to the documents. The first was the trust certification, formal record of the house's ownership, the date of acquisition, the complete history of every tax, insurance payment, and repair, all drawn from trust funds, with a specific note that no marital contribution had ever touched any of it. Diane read the key lines aloud, slowly, letting the room follow. The second was the prenuptial agreement. Turn to the page carrying Renata's signature. The page beneath the residence clause, stating plainly that her right to occupy the house was tied to the marriage, and that she held no right to sell it, transfer it, or use it as collateral in any financial arrangement. Diane noted that Renata had been offered independent counsel before signing, and had declined that offer in writing. The room went quiet in a way rooms rarely do. Not the quiet of people waiting for something. The quiet of people who've stopped expecting anything and are simply absorbing what's in front of them. Renata's expression hadn't broken. What had changed was the quality of her stillness. Compose had turned into controlled, and anyone who'd spent years reading rooms could feel the difference. The third document was Carla's investigative report. Diane didn't read from it in detail. She summarized 10 months of documented contact between Renata and Elliot, dates, locations, records enough to satisfy the infidelity clause written into the agreement, the clause that ended Renata's residential rights on verified evidence of infidelity during the marriage. Elliot's face changed at that, visibly from across the room. The ease left him in stages. The way a presentation falls apart when the material turns out not to be what you were told it was. He looked at Renata. She didn't look back. The fourth document was the one aimed directly at him. Diane laid it down. These are the 2 loan applications filed in the past month through 2 separate lenders, each listing this property as supporting collateral. Each one carries a signed declaration from Ms. Cole certifying the property as marital. She looked toward the lending contact, who had already stopped writing. As of this morning, both lenders have received formal notice that the property is trust-owned and that no declaration of marital ownership carries any legal weight. Both applications are frozen pending that clarification. Elliot set his glass down on the near surface. In the silence of the room, the sound carried. He looked at Renata with an expression that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite disbelief. The look of a man realizing the foundation of a major financial plan had been built on assurances he never checked for himself, and starting to work out in real time how that had ever been allowed to happen. Renata's attorney said something about contesting the trust documentation. Diane told him the trust had been established before Renata was even born. Its record was public, and he was welcome to contest it in whatever forum he preferred. Then Diane turned back to Renata and asked the question she'd clearly been saving for that exact room, in front of that exact audience. If this house belongs to you, which document has your name on the ownership record? Renata didn't answer. The board member near the far wall set down his drink and took out his phone. He didn't make a call. He typed something briefly and put it away. I didn't know exactly what he'd written. But I understood that a man with institutional authority over Renata's professional conduct had just watched her publicly claim an asset that wasn't hers in front of two commercial lenders and decided the moment was worth a record. What followed wasn't seen. Renata didn't shout. Elliot didn't argue. The guests didn't erupt. What happened was a slow, orderly emptying of the room. The lending contact excused herself, gathering her things with the efficiency of someone who decided the meeting was over. The hospital contacts offered Renata a few brief, non-committal words and moved toward the door. Otis crossed the room, stopped beside me, and said quietly, "Send me that proposal when you're ready this week." Then he left. Within 20 minutes, the room held only Renata, Elliot, Diane, Renata's attorney, and me. Elliot said, to no one in particular, that he'd been under the impression the property had been fully verified before any applications went in. He said Renata had confirmed it. He said he needed to speak with his own counsel. He picked up his jacket off the back of a chair and left without looking back, without the confidence he'd walked in with, moving through the door the way someone moves when they've already started putting distance between themselves and everything that just happened. Renata's attorney spoke with her quietly near the kitchen. She listened, nodded twice, and they left together. Diane began packing the documents back into her case. I stood near the workshop doorway. The shelving was still there. The proportions of the room were still exactly right. The light would still come through the east window tomorrow morning at the angle I'd planned for it, same as it always had. 3 days later, Renata called. I answered because I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to become the kind of person who handles grief by cutting off every line of contact. Her voice was measured but tight, the register of someone who's rehearsed an opening and isn't fully certain of the ground under it. She said there were things she wanted to talk through directly. She thought there might be a path forward that worked better for both of us. She used the word fair twice in the first minute. She talked about what she'd put into 14 years, about what a reasonable outcome might look like given everything. It was negotiation, dressed up as reflection. I let her get to the end of what she'd prepared. Then I asked, Renata, are you calling to apologize or to negotiate? Silence on the line. The kind that comes when someone is deciding whether the truth or the useful answer is easier to reach for. The answer to both is no, I said, and I ended the call. The divorce moved without much of a fight after that. Renata's attorneys, once they'd seen the full file Diane had assembled, advised against dragging it out. The prenuptial agreement was unambiguous. The trust documentation was airtight, and every public claim Renata had made in front of witnesses was now part of a record any judge could read in about 15 minutes. She kept her personal accounts, her earnings, the investments she'd made on her own. She lost the right to live in the house. The settlement gave her the standard 30 days to collect her things, which I did not contest or shorten. Ashford Memorial's internal review ran on its own timeline, separate from any of it. The board member who'd been at the launch pulled the relevant files the next morning and opened a formal inquiry through proper channels. The redirected contract, the use of hospital resources to support a competing venture. Renata's position ended a few weeks later for reasons that had nothing to do with the divorce and everything to do with decisions she made inside her own job. I hadn't started that review. I'd simply made sure the person with the authority to act on what he saw was standing in the room when Renata made her claims. Priya got a call from procurement 6 weeks after the launch. The donor wing contract, the one redirected to Elliot's preferred firm, was being reopened after the internal review. Her original proposal was still on file. She was invited to resubmit. She called to ask what I thought she should do. Submit it, I said. The work was good the first time. Nothing about it changed. She submitted. She got the contract. I gave Priya a key to the East Wing 6 months later, once renovations were finished. A proper studio space, good light, enough room to spread drawings across 3 tables at once. The first morning she came in, I was already at my own bench. We worked for hours. without talking much, which is exactly how it should be. Otis stopped by that spring to look at a proposal I'd sent him back in January. He sat across the workbench from me with the drawings spread between us and asked about the East Wing. I told him what it was for. He looked at it for a second and said it was a good use of the space. Then we went back to the proposal because there was work to do. A year after the launch, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. Renata. I answered. She asked if I ever thought about the marriage. Not how it ended. What had actually been. I told her the truth. I think about the work I put into it. I think about the choices I made that were real. I don't think much about the version of it you decided to tell people. She said she understood. I said I didn't need her to. I set the phone down and looked at the floor plan spread across my table. A house I'd been commissioned to build from the ground up. The first project like it I'd taken in years. The proportions were good. The light was going to work exactly the way it should. I'd already spent 3 weeks on the east-facing wall alone, making sure it would do precisely what I needed it to do. I picked up my pencil, found the line that needed adjusting, and I drew it. There is something worth sitting with here. The people who build things carefully and quietly are rarely the ones anyone talks about first, but they're the ones still standing once the noise finally clears. If that is the kind of story that stays with you, this channel is where they live. Subscribe, and if this one meant something to you, send it to someone who needs to hear it today.